Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 1 April 2025. It is the 272nd anniversary of the birth of Joseph Marie Comte de Maistre, who was born 272 years ago today in 1753 in Chambéry in the Duchy of Savoy, which was at that time part of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, which was ruled by the House of Savoy. Joseph de Maistre wrote in French, and his thought was centrally concerned with the French Revolution, but he wasn't himself French in the narrow sense. He was a Savoyard who, when Savoy was an independent country ruled by the House of Savoy. In my episode on A.J.P. Taylor, I said that France was always the most unified and centralized of Europe's kingdoms, especially compared to Germany. But even France was divided into petty kingdoms, and Savoy was among the last of these to survive as an independent political entity. The decisive event in the life of de Maistre was the French Revolution, as it was the decisive event for almost everyone of his generation. In my episode on Hegel, I quoted Wordsworth from his poem The Prelude. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Both Wordsworth and Hegel were 19 when the French Revolution began, and being caught up in the excitement of the event, presumably they experienced the very heaven of it. But de Maistre had a wife, two children, and a career when the French Revolution popped off, and he wasn't caught up in the excitement of it like Wordsworth and Hegel. His response to the French Revolution would, in a sense, come to define his life. The French Revolution sent a shock wave through Europe, not only politically, economically, and militarily, but also intellectually. Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France is among the best known of the initial intellectual responses to the revolution, excuse me. It's a classic but it's not above criticism. Sir Philip Francis had written a letter to in a letter to Edmund Burke that Burke's praise of Marie Antoinette was pure foppery. It was a resort to sentimentalism in defense of the Ancien Regime. No one would have accused de Maistre of pure foppery. In de Maistre's response to the French Revolution, Considerations on France, first published in 1796, he wrote, quote, "What distinguishes the French Revolution and what makes it an event unique in history is that it is radically evil. No element of good relieves the picture it presents. It reaches the highest point of corruption ever known. It is pure impurity. In what scene of history can be found so many vices acting at once on the same stage? Such an appalling combination of baseness and cruelty, such profound immorality, such a disdain for all decency," unquote. In 1792, the French Revolutionary Army overran Chambéry, where de Maistre was living, and he fled the onslaught, first to Turin. Then he returned to Chambéry the next year after the dust had settled. But he didn't stay there long, moving on to Lausanne, where he began to write counter-revolutionary tracts while frequenting the salon of Madame de Staël. After Lausanne, de Maistre went to Venice, then to Cagliari, and then in 1802, 10 years after his first flight from Chambéry, the House of Savoy, then holding court in Cagliari after the French had overrun Turin, sent de Maistre as an ambassador to Tsarist Russia, where he lived in St. Petersburg for 15 years until after the fall of Napoleon. Turin was restored to the House of Savoy in the Treaty of Vienna, and de Maistre lived out the rest of his life there, holding the offices of magistrate and minister of state. I said that de Maistre began to write as a counter-revolutionary when he was at Lausanne, and de Maistre went on to become among the greatest of reactionaries. Of course, de Maistre makes an appearance in one of Isaiah Berlin's six enemies of human liberty alongside Helvetius, Rousseau, Fichte, Hegel, and Saint-Simon. Berlin was a tireless apologist for the Enlightenment and as such couldn't ignore de Maistre's unremitting assault on Enlightenment ideology. In Freedom and Its Betrayal, Berlin wrote, quote, Maistre earns our gratitude as a prophet of the most violent, the most destructive forces which have threatened and still threaten the liberty and the ideals of normal human beings, unquote. De Maistre might have easily schooled Berlin on the Enlightenment's own threat to the liberty and the ideals of normal human beings, but I'll leave that aside. De Maistre was also a great literary stylist. And when you read de Maistre, you can tell that he loves being a contrarian of his time, and even you could say he luxuriates in his reactionary views. In other words, Joseph de Maistre was a born troll. For example, de Maistre wasn't content merely with defending the church and the Ancien Regime. He conspicuously praised the Spanish Inquisition as a benevolent institution. Here's what de Maistre wrote in his book, Letters on the Spanish Inquisition. Quote, "Nothing can be more upright, more learned, or more incorruptible than the grand tribunals of Spain. And then, if to this general character we add that of the Catholic priesthood, it is impossible, even without any appeal to experience, not to feel and be convinced that nothing in the universe can really be more calm and gentle, more impartial and humane than the tribunal of the Inquisition." Unquote. In going out of his way to praise the humanity of Spanish Inquisition, even writing an entire book about it, de Maistre wasn't defending the Ancien Regime of France or criticizing the French Revolution. He was going back to an earlier attack on the legitimacy of the church. De Maistre was, in effect, attacking the Black Legend, the familiar narrative of Spanish brutality, rapacity, and intolerance in the New World, which had been vigorously promoted by the Protestant states as a way to undermine Spanish power during the early modern period. The Black Legend was not only used against the Spanish, it was also used against the church, and de Maistre saw it as one of the many modern attacks on the church that led to the rise of unbelief and therefore contributed to making the French Revolution possible. He relentlessly attacked the philosophical foundations of the French Revolution, writing against philosophers like John Locke, David Hume, and Rousseau, and against historians like Gibbon, making a radical critique of Enlightenment ideology that didn't stop at condemning the violence of the revolution, but sought to show that the entire enterprise was incoherent and therefore condemned to fail from the start. Of John Locke, he wrote, quote, "What reproaches cannot rightly be leveled against Locke, and how can he be exonerated from having unsettled morality in order to overthrow the theory of innate ideas without knowing what he was attacking?" Unquote. And he said of Hume was, quote, "perhaps the most dangerous and the most culpable of those fatal writers who will not cease to damn the last century in the eyes of posterity, the one who has used the most talent with the most composure to produce the most evil," unquote. And de Maistre wrote of Rousseau's treacherous mind and his half-knowledge and the evil heart of Gibbon. While de Maistre's criticisms can be as openly vituperative as Schopenhauer's criticisms of Hegel, they aren't mere ad hominem attacks on thinkers whose work he rejected. Like Schopenhauer, de Maistre formulated a philosophy of science that was ahead of his time, particularly in his book on Francis Bacon, an examination of the philosophy of Bacon. Bacon was, for de Maistre, the source and origin of rationalism, scientism, and atheism in the modern world. But again, this isn't mere invective and ad hominem. De Maistre had a point in his criticisms. I often discuss in my newsletters the absence of a science of science, and de Maistre exploits this weakness of science, though he doesn't explicitly diagnose the problem in the way that I do. It's because science itself as an enterprise is incomplete that it can't exhaustively account for itself, which I attribute to a lack of a science of science, that science admits of ellipses and blind spots and dead ends. One of these dead ends is foundational, and that is what constitutes the basis of all fundamental concepts. Definitions will only take us so far, as de Maistre observed. Quote, From all that has been said about definitions, it is obvious that essences are indefinable, that is to say, unknowable by way of definition. For to explain this For to explain in this way what they are, it would be necessary to put them in equation. Moreover, an essence only being able to be compared with itself, it remains demonstrated that it can only be known in essence by intuition, unquote. So definitions can point the way for us, but ultimately they can only point to the possibility of intuiting some aspect of the world that de Maistre calls an essence. Sometimes de Maistre sounds like a contemporaneous critic of the effort by early 20th century positivists to formulate a logically perfect language, as when he writes, quote, reading the modern metaphysicians, you will come across huge generalizations on the importance of symbols and on the advantages of what they call a philosophical language, which should be created a priori or perfected by philosophers, unquote. Our thought, and our scientific thought most of all, must begin with axioms, or if you prefer, with what de Maistre elsewhere calls fundamental truths. In the translator's introduction to an examination of the philosophy of Bacon, Richard A. Lebrun quotes from a notebook of de Maistre where he has written concerning fundamental truths, quote, why would it be necessary to prove them? They are clear in themselves. To see them, it is only necessary to open one's eyes. They flow from the most evident principles. Metaphysics demonstrates them. History proclaims them, unquote. De Maistre believed that the empiricist epistemology of Locke and the skepticism of Hume both followed from and contributed to a failure to reckon with fundamental truths that are truths of reason, not of experience, and which are known only in and through intuition. The same failure to reckon with the limitations of science made the human element in science a blind spot for Enlightenment thinkers. Bacon had earlier also tried to reckon with the limitations imposed by the human element in the sciences. Bacon is especially remembered for his discussion of the four idols, the idols of the tribe, of the cave, of the theater, and of the marketplace. Today, we would call these idols cognitive biases. De Maistre is unconvinced by Bacon's critique of his idols. He writes, quote, the word prejudice is too subtle for his ear. He will say idol because an idol is a statue of wood, stone, or metal that has a form, a color that one can touch and place on a pedestal. Instead of saying prejudices of a nation, prejudices of a group, etc., he will say idols of the public place, idols of the tribe, etc. And those personal prejudices that we hold more or less by character or habit, he calls idols of the cave. For the interior of man is for him only a humid cavern. The errors are quite similar to the concretions that are distilled from the vault and hang as stalactites in ordinary caves, unquote. De Maistre believes that Bacon has been deluded by his need to see things in material terms. We could see this criticism as overly petty, but as part of a larger argument on the failure of Bacon's critique of his idols. De Maistre wrote, quote, there is no more terrible sermon on the danger of prejudices and on the empire exercised by the idols of the cave, an empire from which even the best minds do not always know how to free themselves. As to those who do not have a system to support, after having smiled a minute on the destiny of books and reputation, they will leave admiration to the learned author of the introduction, only reserving for themselves the astonishment that we cannot fairly refuse to all that we have just read, unquote. Science and scientific knowledge remain human, all too human, and Bacon's critique of the idols isn't sufficient, in de Maistre's views, to exercise those idols. I discussed problems related to this in my episode on Nikolai Danilevsky, who insisted on the cultural dimension of science. De Maistre doesn't emphasize the cultural relativity of science in the way that Danilevsky did, except to argue that Western civilization has been as successful as it is in science because of Christian theology. For de Maistre, it is perfected theology that is the basis of science. Quote, the more theology is perfected in a country, the more it is fruitful in true science. This is why Christian nations have surpassed all others in the sciences, and why the Indians and the Chinese, with their so much and too vaunted science, will never catch up to us while we remain respectively what we are. Copernicus, Kepler, Descartes, Newton, the Bernoullis, etc., are productions of the gospel, unquote. You might be tempted to see this as a merely eccentric interpretation of science, but the philosophy of science that de Maistre formulated is relevant to his wider thought, and I'll try to explain how this is the case. But first, I'm going to find my way back to this by way of a detour. I first learned about de Maistre, as with so many other thinkers I've encountered, when I happened upon a book in a used bookstore. It was a slim paperback with the title On God and Society, but the text was de Maistre's brief but comprehensive essay on the generative principle of political constitutions and other human institutions, originally published in 1809. This essay, which is, I think, the best way into de Maistre's thought, opens with his fundamental theme, quote, "One of the gravest errors of a century which embraced all of them was to believe that a political constitution could be written and created a priori, whereas reason and experience agree that a constitution is a divine work, and that it is precisely the most fundamental and essentially constitutional elements in a nation's laws that cannot be written," unquote. He returns to this theme in many forms, that written law is as nothing, that divine law is the ultimate basis of human law, and that the essence of law is ineffable. He summarizes this view in section 9 of the essay in 4 points. Quote, "That the fundamentals of political constitutions exist before all written laws. 2, that a constitutional law is and can only be the development of the sanction of a pre-existent and unwritten right. 3, that the most essential, the most intrinsically constitutional, and the really fundamental is not written and never should, and even should not be if the state is not to be imperiled. 4, that the weakness and fragility of a constitution is in direct relationship to the number of written constitutional articles," unquote. De Maistre in this work also characterizes history as experimental politics. This is where de Maistre's philosophy of science becomes relevant. We need to see this claim that history is experimental politics in the light of his criticism of Enlightenment science in his book on Bacon, in which he wrote of Bacon, quote, "What he was also perfectly ignorant of is that even in the natural sciences, any conclusive experiment is only a proposition, a necessary part of an internal syllogism. Otherwise it would not conclude, which again obviously proves the existence of original ideas independent of all experience. For man can measure nothing without a previous measure to which he relates himself. Even experiment becomes useless to him if he cannot relate it to a prior principle that he uses to judge the validity of the experiment," unquote. We can understand history as experimental politics in this way. That is to say, that the political experiment is only a proposition, and it must be related to a prior principle that is used to judge the validity of the experiment. We can see how this plays into de Maistre's theological presuppositions, which serve as the prior principles by which all experiment is to be judged. Again, I'll come back to this, but by way of a detour. We've seen that one of de Maistre's themes is that the unwritten law is as nothing compared to the written law is as nothing compared to the unwritten law. He goes further and denies the very possibility that a nation can be created by fiat. Quote, "No assembly of men whatever can create a nation. All the bedlams in the world could not produce anything more absurd or extravagant than such an enterprise," unquote. Given de Maistre's criticism of Enlightenment political thought, and his denial of the very possibility that a group could assemble to found a political society, one might reasonably suppose that de Maistre would have held the founding fathers of the U.S. in low estimation and roundly condemned their efforts. But this wasn't the case. John C. Murray, in his paper, The Political Thought of Joseph de Maistre, quotes de Maistre as writing, quote, liberty, insulted in Europe, has winged its flight to another hemisphere, unquote. So de Maistre doesn't tar all constitutional regimes with the same brush. In his considerations on France, de Maistre carefully spelled out the way in which he believed the American example differed from the French example. Quote, number one, English America had a king, but did not see him. It was a stranger to the splendor of monarchy, and to it the sovereign was a kind of supernatural power that did not impinge on the senses. Two, it possessed the democratic element that was present in the constitution of the mother country. Three, it possessed, besides, elements carried to it by many of the first colonists who were born amid political and religious troubles and were almost all Republican minded. Four, with these materials and on the plan of the balance of three powers they drew from their ancestors, the Americans have built and not started from a tabula rasa as did the French, unquote. De Maistre also criticized the American Constitution in the same passage, adding, quote, not only do I doubt the stability of American government, but the particular institutions of English America inspire no confidence in me, unquote. These remarks on America are from early works, and the later de Maistre might have been less likely to draw careful distinctions between the Revolution in America and the Revolution in France. Nevertheless, I find it interesting that de Maistre made this distinction between French and American revolutions, and that he saw the French as engaged in an exercise of tabula rasa, that is, blank slate legislation, while the American founding fathers were engaged in an exercise of making their own tradition fully explicit. De Maistre might have thought better of this later, but a reactionary case for the traditionalism of the U.S. Constitution could be argued on the basis of the distinction that de Maistre made. It's also relevant in this context that Edmund Burke was sympathetic to the American cause, and probably for the same or for similar reasons. De Maistre scholar Carolina Armenteros argues that de Maistre's conception of history, especially in his book The Pope, is Europeanist, and it may follow from this essentially Europeanist outlook that de Maistre's ideas don't fit the Western Hemisphere and American traditions and institutions. Armenteros writes in her book, The French Idea of History, Joseph de Maistre and His Heirs, 1794-1854, quote, exposing a largely unknown monarchical theory of liberty, Dupape claims that civil and political liberty are the products, first, of freedom from the passions, and second, of the order that is born of the continual opposition between spiritual and temporal sovereignties. The king who can be deposed of his people's request is no longer absolute, and the church that performs this function is no pillar of the state, unquote. I could observe of these ideas that, while applicable to European history, de Maistre has written that America was a stranger to the splendor of monarchy, and by the same token, it was equally a stranger to the splendor of the papacy. So it's arguable that the application of these ideas to the American context would constitute what Gilbert Ryle called a category error. If I'm right, then de Maistre's Europeanist works on the Pope, the French Revolution, and the Spanish Inquisition aren't really relevant to America, or at least aren't directly relevant to North America. It would be an interesting analytical exercise to follow out the consequences of this view for the differences between Spanish America, which we now call Latin America, and North America, which has been dominated by British influence. But I will leave that for another time, while wishing a happy birthday to Joseph de Maistre. Thanks for listening.